Welcome, data people. We are Zuma. My name is Matt, and this is Data for Good. This podcast is brought to you by Zuma. Zuma is a dedicated recruitment company for senior data, insights, and analytics professionals, connecting you with Berlin's most influential companies. The Data for Good podcast is for the world of data analytics and engineering, giving you access to the thoughts and opinions of Berlin's most successful data people. Today, we are joined by Max Schultze, Data Engineering Manager at Zalando. So this is going to be a great episode. Max is going to talk to us about data mesh, different personas in data, and also the importance of networking. Max, welcome. How are you?
All good, all good. Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to actually be here on the podcast, and I'm very much looking forward to our conversation.
It's an honor to have you on. Now, for those who don't know, there is a story behind the color yellow. Can you tell us a bit more about
that? Yes, definitely I can. So, as some of you might know, like the color yellow and especially my yellow suit, I'm only wearing the tie today, but that's it has become a bit of my trademark over the last couple of months and years even. It all started off as a joke at a friend's wedding where the initial colored suit actually made its first appearance. But at that wedding, we took like a couple of pictures. I enjoyed the pictures and I started using them on social media as well. And ultimately, I was at a conference last year at the Data Innovation Summit in Stockholm, where I was giving a presentation, and the organizer of the conference was actually himself rocking an amazing red suit. And he saw the picture of me when I was introducing myself, and he immediately told me after my talk, if I would want to ever come back to this conference, I definitely would have to wear the suit next time.
that?
And then they invited me again this year in May, so I didn't have a choice. And I have basically like started rocking the suit on like multiple occasions since.
Amazing. Is it the same suit? Has it survived, or have you been updating?
Well, what can I say? Some people had different effects throughout the pandemic on themselves. I might have grown a little bit in various dimensions, so I actually got a new copy of the same suit.
Why not? Why not? Treat yourself. Perfect. So, yeah, for those who didn't know, most do know, most recognizable you are by the yellow suit. So keep an eye out for anyone who is at conferences, particularly in Berlin. One question that we do like to start the podcast with to our guests is think back as far as you can, but yeah, as far back as you can remember, what is your first memory of data?
Well, I think it goes all the way back to school, to be honest, where I had some computer science courses, and I had a very gifted teacher at that time, who wasn't even like a school teacher for like many years, but he actually came in for as a side, like from the side, with like lots of industry experience already. And at that time, like computer science courses were still like pretty new at school, so there was not really like a clear flashed out plan on like what were you supposed to teach. So he was just like drawing from his experience from the industry and taught us a lot of things that later out turned to be very, very useful throughout the rest of our lives. And one of those things was databases. So actually, when I was like, 16, 17 years or so, was the first time I came in touch with databases. Not just in like playing around with some data structures or anything like that, but really like going all the way down to understanding how these beasts work behind the scenes. And that has triggered my curiosity into the data space that I definitely followed up on later on.
Amazing. So it started out when you were 16, you were unknowingly exposed to data science from someone who came in, or was it an earlier age when
No,
this
it
person
was
came
around
in?
that time, I would say,
Yeah.
like the last 2-3 years of school before I then went on to continue with studying computer science, also here in Berlin, and where I was lucky enough to actually have run into some project that back then was called Stratosphere, that later on became to be known Apache Flink. So I was lucky enough to actually get directly in touch there, talk to a lot of people, directly contribute as well, and even write my thesis also about Apache Flink at that time.
Oh, wow. I think there's been so much evolution of the data world from that database experience to, I mean, what we call now is the modern data stack, and something that we spoke about previously, and data mesh, and how that is super popular at the moment. And you've got the great opportunity to be able to implement that across such a strong company such as Zalando. But for those who don't know, what is a data mesh?
Yeah, data mesh is essentially the modern days answer to organizational scaling problems around data. Right? Like data, of course, like amounts of data have massively grown over the last 2 decades by now already. All the systems got more complex in terms of like being able to also take on vast amounts of data. We are now storing petabytes of data. We are now being able to actually run compute engines with like hundreds of nodes and hundreds of clusters in parallel to also like get ahead of actually analyzing all this data and making sense of it. But ultimately, we reached a point that the problem was no longer technical scaling, but organizational scaling. And this is like one important angle that data mesh is trying to get ahead of, in the sense that you're trying to address all these problems that everybody has for like not finding the right data, not having it properly described, like dealing with data quality issues day in and day out, dealing with data responsibility issues of not having clearly defined ownership. And these are like a bunch of the core challenges that data mesh is then trying to get ahead of. How that really works is data mesh ultimately boils down into 4 main pillars, which are the concepts that actually stand behind it, the things that make it a bit more tangible. The first thing is to actually treat data as a product. So you actually think of it as something that you would want to sell, right? Like that you would want to sell to either some people that you're working with internally, externally, but you actually think of the value that your data is generating when you actually share it with others. And this builds up on top of, again, addressing these challenges that I mentioned before about not clearly defining data ownership by picking up a little bit of some of the ideas from domain-driven design, and also pushing this into the data space, that you actually clearly define responsibilities about data, and you push data ownership into the areas of the people that know best where the data has been originally produced, that have all the insights, to actually ask them to also take on the additional challenges that come with providing good quality data and sharing it appropriately. Of course, that is also not always that easy, because that usually means you're pushing additional responsibilities onto people that do not know very well how to actually deal with data in the first place. And that is why it's also super important that you add the third leg of data mesh, which is to provide data platform capabilities, ideally through self-service infrastructure, right? Like you need to make it as easy as possible to work with data. And this is honestly also where most of my experience is coming from. I've been on the data platform side for the last 7 years or so, to really provide services to a large scale company when it comes to really working with data.
Okay. So it sounds like data became a very useful tool, but it wasn't integrating with business as well as it should have done.
Yes, this is exactly the case. And everybody on the business side wanted data, but it was still like a black box that nobody really understood, for that matter. Because nobody really could say, like, you could have 2 people that look at the same data from different angles, and 2 people that try to answer the same question actually come up with completely different numbers, and thus make the completely different decisions, because you have data that is flowing through like many different systems, that is coming in from many different angles, that has data quality issues that nobody's actually getting ahead of. And like all these problems made it really hard to actually push for proper decision making. And now that more and more companies try to really become data driven, that means data is becoming more and more important also for the business side. And now, slowly but surely, people are realizing that if you want to have good data to make your decisions based on, that means you also need to invest into it, and you need to actually set up the people the right way so that they can do the groundwork and that they can prepare the data properly so that you can then have clean data to actually base your decisions on.
This may be a bit of a chicken and an egg scenario. What's more challenging, educating the data people on business specifics or teaching the business people more about data and how it can be utilized?
It's quite an interesting question, actually, because on the one hand side, like parts of these are self-sufficient learning processes for that matter. If business people don't have good data, they will realize it and they will see the problems that they're actually facing. And even though they might just be pushing because they don't have the insights into how the data actually arrives on their desk, so that they might just think, yeah, it's just a quick thing that can be fixed. That there's like a little bit of just a lack of communication and also a lack of empathy with the different people working in the different positions. From that angle, still, like the business need feels the problems. So often you will see the situation that they also challenge the situation and they say, okay, something needs to change because I need my good data to actually work with that. Whereas from the other side, like data people have historically often been heavily focused around like tech stuff, right? Like they are usually like geeking out about the newest processing engine that's running around the corner and trying to get into like the cool and fancy of new technology. And that can, of course, make it a bit harder to actually focus on the business problems that you have at hand. If all that you have experienced your whole life is some business person writing a ticket for you and you are just looking at the specs and you're implementing that, that makes it much more challenging also to like expand your mindset and to also look at the business angle of things.
How do we help these maybe data people who love solving problems and tackling these challenges to become more aware of the business needs and what the company is trying to achieve?
So usually the data people are also, in addition to like a little bit of a disconnect from the actual business side, are often also in the position that they are completely overloaded because like everybody wants to get to the good stuff of the data. So they are solving the requests of everyone in the company and they are slowly but surely becoming the bottleneck of the organization as well. Right. But interestingly, I think there's also like a little bit of a two birds, one stone thing here where it all starts from having proper communication between the different parties, right? Because the whole idea of just like throwing a ticket over the fence and then having somebody implement something against an interface and throwing it back, and then just there being ping pong on technical messages 1,000 times before something is actually properly happening. Like this is something that simply doesn't work anymore. Yeah? The data challenges are so complex that even different people with different perspectives describe the same thing in different words and completely misunderstand each other. So that's why it's so important to bring together the people and actually like have to understand each other and have to actually start also creating some empathy for the position of the respective others. Because as long as you have this over the fence thingy, you always treat them as the enemy, right? As the person who is like creating all the mess that you actually need to deal with. And this is something that needs to stop, right? You need to actually understand that there's a human being that's sitting on the other side of the fence, and that if you actually open the door and go through it, there's a person that you can talk to that has huge challenges similar to what you actually have. And that by talking to each other, you might actually be able to sort out some of these challenges much more from an organizational angle than from just an angle of solving technical problems.
I couldn't help but think of a video that has been shown on LinkedIn recently. That's two dogs barking at each other when the fence is closed or the gate is closed and you open it and they're best friends. But it's a situation that software engineering faced many, many years ago, and the introduction of DevOps. How can we introduce best practices from other areas in a business to help us improve this situation?
It's actually quite funny because exactly what you described, like the changes that have happened also in the culture with the introduction with DevOps, with the introduction of like agile development methodologies into tech companies. We are undergoing a very similar change on the data side right now, actually, that like all that we are actually trying to do is to enable people to become more agile, to become better at like local decision making when it comes to advancing the problems that they are working on. And yet still, because data mesh itself is just a huge hype and a buzzword, there's also a lot of pushback because people don't really understand that the methodology behind it is something that is not entirely new to us. It's really something that that especially on the tech side, we've actually been able to gather quite a lot of experience already over the past decade or so. But now that we are finally arriving at a point that we want to apply similar baselines also on the data side, there's still like a lot of buzz around that where people are like just like fighting over scraps.
So to help people understand, with data mesh and self-service has been mentioned as well, where are we trying to get to? I know things will change very quickly over the coming years, but at the moment with our roadmaps with data mesh, what are we trying to achieve? Where are we trying to get to in simple terms?
So the interesting thing is that like ultimately, a friend of mine actually said that recently. The first rule of data mesh is not mention data mesh, because interestingly enough, there's exactly right. There's so much buzz about the word itself that people forget to talk about the concepts behind it, right? And actually, once you cut to the cheese and you actually talk about the concepts behind it, like this data as a product and the domain-driven ownership and also the platform part of it, all of a sudden people start becoming reasonable and understand that this is something that actually helps the organization as a whole. And like the real intent and the real direction that we are heading into is that we are trying to set up our companies and our organizations in a way that we can have a sustainable environment for everybody that is working with data. Data is not accessible to anyone at the moment, like not to anyone, to everyone, sorry.
Yeah.
Data is not accessible to everyone at the moment because some people simply do not have the knowledge how to use a certain tool because the tools are too complex for less technical people to use them, right? Or we have like overcomplicated processes to actually like getting access to data or even finding the data that we want to work with. And like trying to address all these things, as odd as that sounds, it really feels like taking baby steps in like discovering how to properly work with data. And like this is really the direction that we are trying to take, that we are maturing our organizations from all angles when it comes to like any perspective that requires data to then be able to also work with it properly.
So it sounds like people are the key, and this is the fundamental part of how we're going to move forward in the data world is people, education.
Yeah.
There are many different personas within the data world. Where are we at now, and how are those evolving with the introduction of new tools and new awareness?
Yeah. So interestingly, like when we just look back a couple of years, like it was mostly you had engineers and then you had business people, mostly on the analytical side, that had like some idea on, I don't know, like looking at a dashboard, or if they were a bit more in the middle, like more as what we would now call a data analyst, or back then like more maybe somebody with a BI background, able to like run some, I don't know, like SQL queries themselves to actually generate insights on more raw formats of the data. But like the interesting thing is that the lines are massively being blurred right now. So like on the one hand side, of course, we are not anymore since many years already focusing just on like BI and like reacting on things that had happened in the past. But of course, like the whole ML space that has opened up, you have applied scientists that are deeply looking into the parts of understanding training models, like understanding different parts of the business, discovering patterns, and like really also pushing ML models to the production to predict certain things or to react to changes immediately. And then like if you go a little bit further into the scale, now also you have ML engineers, right, that are not just focusing on the core of the actual like model development anymore, but we have realized that productionizing a model is actually where the true value is coming from. And productionizing things requires certain engineering skills, certain also ops skills, right? So data ops is something that is coming up from that side. But when you then move further in and you're entering more like the core data engineering space, so to say, even there's massive differences. You have people that are more on the platform side, right? That are actually the engineers that are providing the platform capabilities. They are dealing with completely different issues than the people that are actually working with the data themselves. They are really like focusing on like scalability of systems that is on a completely different level, even just when it comes to, I don't know, providing the infrastructure, for instance. If you then walk into the other end of the spectrum, you're entering more like the analytics space again, where like some term that has recently been coined, the analytics engineer has shown up recently, which is like somehow like switching the blurring the boundary between the data engineering space and the analytics space, because they are now mostly the people that are sitting within the teams and like building data pipelines to actually take care of the specific challenges and already getting much closer to the business to answer some questions there. And then of course still you have all the way over to the business analysts that have very little to none actual technical skills, that are much more focused on the actual business problems at hand, that are just like looking at the data that has been prepared by somebody else to I don't know, like analyze certain dashboards, looking at certain reports, to again understand what's going on in the business to make decisions based on that. And this is like how what used to be like very clear cut between the different roles has entirely blurred all over the place when it comes to that.
It feels like we're kind of in an era of moving from generalism into specialism within the data space, and we are becoming more professionalized. Data is now becoming a profession.
Yes, definitely.
What are your thoughts on that?
No, I agree to that. And again, like, especially when you're looking at, I don't know, hiring, for instance, right? You're quite an expert on that part as well. Like everybody can call themselves a data engineer nowadays because they have looked at 3 numbers in a row at some point. And they maybe know a little bit of Python that they just picked up last week, right? So this is of course like only showcases how much the interest to enter the space is also become, but also how much the need from the industry as a whole for just data people in general is growing more and more. But the interesting part there is as well is that data, of course, does not always need to immediately mean deeply technical, right? Like one of the most important and key roles I think that we are now seeing also with data mesh coming up is data product manager, right? You need to actually have people that understand the value of the data that you are offering to your stakeholders within your organization or even outside. And like this is like a new key role that didn't exist in that form up until a couple of years ago, maybe, where you actually have like data focused teams that now do not just provide massive amounts of data sets that are dumped somewhere, and then if somebody wants to use them, feel free to do so, but that you actually have product managers within the data teams that keep track of all the stakeholders that they are working with. They understand where the value is actually generated from the data that they are providing, and that are also able to then communicate to inside the teams because they understand, again, the challenges that they are facing when it comes to actually building proper data products and describing the business context around them. So like data product manager is, I think, like one of the new key roles that has emerged like over the last 2-3 years or so, that has been massively pushed with the introduction of the data mesh term, because that's one of the new key roles that a lot of teams will need.
Yeah, I've seen more and more of them emerging at companies across Berlin. Now, one position that has kind of evolved, and it's getting mixed reviews. Some people for it, some people are not. Chief Data Officer.
That's a
Not
very
to get
interesting
you
role.
not to get you in any trouble, but yeah, what are your thoughts?
It's a very interesting role because, like, I always love to describe it in a way that the role of a chief data officer is to make themselves obsolete. And because, like, usually chief data officers are introduced in companies where you have a very, let's say, legacy way of how you're looking at data that is mostly driven by, I don't know, like legacy BI processing, might not have gotten the last 7 hints to actually maybe update your technology a little bit to be able to also cope with the new needs that your organization have. Maybe a lot of like organizational stuff that is really messy in terms of like shadow infrastructure that has developed everywhere and like a huge mess in the sense of actually like moving towards a data-driven organization. And then the whole idea is, of course, to try to get ahead of that, right? Like you try to sort that out. You try to make organizational changes. You try to, of course, enable teams also to make technology changes sometimes. But overall, you're an ambassador for pushing data responsibility into the organization. And the interesting thing then is, like, if you look at something like data mesh, ultimately data mesh, when we are pushing for domain ownership and responsibility, that means, again, we are like decentralizing the ownership and the responsibility about data down to the people that know it best, down to where it is actually produced, within the domains, towards the people that actually have the knowledge about the data. So if your goal as a CDO is actually to come in and grow a data organization that is as big as possible so that you have like might over the company or whatever, ultimately what you actually want to aim for is the exact opposite. Yeah, sure, you might still have like a certain central part of the organization that is like offering infrastructure capabilities. That is more like from a data platform angle for that matter. But the actual like core data responsibility are things that you want to decentralize, are things that you want to push closer to the business. So that you actually can take on end-to-end responsibility for certain business topics. And that ultimately lets the CDO be in a position that once they have actually achieved their final goal, then you have a mature data-driven organization, which doesn't have the need for a CDO anymore.
Yeah, it's my job here is done. I think maybe after the release of this podcast, we will see a number of interim CDO positions they're on a short-term contract, but yeah, it's a topic we could dive in a lot deeper. I think while you're on the podcast, we couldn't not talk to you about your active role in the community and what you do for data folks, particularly in Berlin and further afield. So why do you do it? What do you get back from sharing your knowledge and helping so many others?
I personally think that data ultimately is all about community. Like, definitely, like each company has their own data, actually, like in the sense of the actual content of the data, and they make their own decisions and they make their own business. But ultimately, when it comes to the approaches of how you're working with data, or from a more general angle, I think like the data just thrives through its community. Letting alone that it started with like a huge amount of open source systems, right? Like when we look at the most common data processing engines that we have out there right now, Spark, Flink, Trino, like many of them that you have, they are all open source, right? And they already have built in the idea of taking from the community and turning this into something valuable for your company. And I love that thought. And I love to actually also turn this around and give back. And this actually started quite early, to be honest, like way before COVID hit. We were, for instance, organizing some data engineering meetups locally in Berlin, right? Because of the partners that we were also working with, we always got the opportunity to also bring in some very interesting speakers, bringing us to the point that we usually had between 100 or 200 participants for meetups. Right, wow. This is pretty massive, and of course, once COVID hit, that died down a little bit. There hasn't been so much activity around that anymore. But definitely, that didn't mean that I wanted to stop my community contributions. Right? I've been around in many conferences over the last 3-4 years. I even started to give some trainings on data mesh on O'Reilly, started to write a small booklet on the topic as well that has been published on O'Reilly by now as well. So there's a bunch of things that, just giving back is the main thought behind that, because we are always taking from the community when it comes to the usage of all the things that we are trying. So it's as important that we also turn it around and that we also give back.
Amazing. We'll have to get a link to that booklet so we can share that with the listeners.
Yes, definitely.
How would you advise? What tip would you give to someone who wants to be more part of the community? What's the first step to giving back?
Well, I think it's most important that you just figure out like what can you do in a space that you feel comfortable with, right? Usually there are a bunch of opportunities as well with like local data meetups or something like this, right?
Yeah.
Where you can just like go out, listen to some talks, talk to people, get connected, start networking. That's one of the things that we also want to touch on. And just get connected with people that are out there that might already have more experience than you on certain things, so that you can like reach out to them, get feedback on certain things. But also not everyone loves to just like jump out on the stage and do things by themselves immediately right from the start, or like dive deep into certain communities locally where you're involved with people right from the start. So it might very well be that your way of getting involved in the community might be through certain online measurements, right? Like writing blogs, getting involved with other bigger communities on open source projects, like starting to make some small contributions that are focusing more on the technical side, or even up as high level as like just giving feedback on certain things, or specifying certain requirements that you're having in your setup, because those are the things that usually allow a community to move forward. And it doesn't always have to be that you just jump out there and you join something in person. Not everybody enjoys that, right? I definitely do, and I love like meeting people in person and talking about. As you can hear right now, I could literally talk for hours. So that's one of the biggest gains that I always saw from communities as well.
It sounds like if you start small, more people will appreciate your support, and more opportunities to share your knowledge of a greater group of people will present itself. And that's maybe the experience that you've had.
And don't hesitate to reach out. Just because somebody's out there and you see they are much more experienced than you and you don't dare to ever talk to them, don't shy away from just like shooting them a message on LinkedIn or whatever. Like there's a lot of people that are still like actually pretty deep into networking that are responding to messages. Like I try to at least like read through all the things that I'm getting in as well. And sometimes people just shoot me some random questions about their particular setup, and if I have some advice, and I try to get back to them as well.
Nice. Well, if we'll say to anyone who sends a message on LinkedIn, if you start with the word yellow, then you know it will be from this podcast, and you'll do your best to get back to them. And I think also data is going to get ever more important. And you mentioned about some of the other business areas who are it's going to support them in their work. So if you are a software engineer, a product manager, or even someone working in finance who wants to maybe get a bit more into analytics, like you said, Max, don't hesitate to drop a question, attend these meetups. As we've heard, it's quite a accepting group as a data profession, and it's quite a leveler. The data doesn't lie, so it's good to give it a go. Find out where you might fit in. If you're a storyteller, for example, maybe look at the analytics. If you enjoy fixing things, maybe have a look at the engineering side. I mean, what do you think, Max?
Yes, definitely. And like as you said, right? Like the community is very open. Like especially the local Berlin community as well. Like there are so many meetups out there that I've participated in so far. There are local conferences that you can attend, and there's so many possibilities just to like randomly reach out to people and just have a personal conversation as well. And getting into the data space is really like there's still a highly sought after need to get more people into data, and I don't see that stopping anytime soon. So if you also want to set yourself up for success, that's definitely a good starting point. Yeah, just get started from any angle that actually suits you well. Find something fun. Yeah, find something fun to get involved with, because ultimately, like, this is one of the things that I also love so much about data space. Like, almost every challenge that you're facing is actually interesting, and you might want to dive into that. It always just depends on the perspective that you're taking on it. And you need to find something that you really enjoy. You need to have a reason for you personally why you dive into that. And then I can definitely guarantee that the journey will be successful, because if you're driving your own move into the data space with personal passion, then nothing will get in your way.
Yeah, and we must put a warning out there, because we have seen time and time again, when you get a taste for data, there's no turning back.
Definitely.
You can get in quite deep, and you think you've solved something, and something else appears.
It's always just the tip of the iceberg.
Exactly. Well, Max, I must thank you. It's been a great episode. Unfortunately, that's all we have time for today. I think these topics, we didn't even cover some topics that we discussed, but they lead quite nicely onto a future podcast. We would love to have you on again in the future, hopefully a live one, maybe in Berlin next summer. But that's all we have time for today, unfortunately. Thank you again, Max, for your time and your rich insights. It's been educational and topics that I know that people will want to know more about. To the listeners, as always, drop your questions and feedback into the comments section, and we'll pick out some to be answered on future podcasts. And please don't forget to like and share, so we can reach as many people as possible. But from me and Max today, it is goodbye. Thank you, Max.
Was an absolute pleasure. Really loved our conversation, and already looking forward to any future follow-ups.
Us too. It's been an honor. Thank you. Ciao for now.